So after talking about all these domains and the different levels and how you move up through the learning, it's also important to think about learning styles. How do students learn? Because not all students learn the same way. And in general, you can think of these learning styles as a spectrum. No one is necessarily all one or the other in each of these pairs. People generally fall somewhere on this spectrum in between each pair. And people can be somewhere left or right on the spectrum of each of these four kind of qualitative pairs. So an active learner is someone who learns by doing. They've got to get out there, they've got to try it, they've got to put their hands on it, they've got to practice it, they have to be able to do it in order to learn it. Whereas a reflective learner learns better by thinking quietly about the information, reading, studying, maybe talking with a mentor or an instructor, and thinking hard, generally kind of by themselves, really taking it on board and developing an understanding that they wouldn't otherwise. And that's obviously very different from an active learner, and somewhere on that spectrum is going to be each individual student. Sensing versus intuitive. So a sensing student likes facts, just wants to learn the concrete facts, lay everything out for me. Give me that cookbook, give me those steps, step 1, step 2, step 3. An intuitive learner prefers to discover possibilities in relationships. They don't want to be given a prescriptive way to do something. They want to be put in a situation where they can discover the relationships between the things that they're learning, imagine new possibilities, implement them, see how they work, and then having tried it, really get that sense for what works and what doesn't work. Visual versus verbal. So visual, this is going to be a student who remembers best what they see, especially kind of visual, not textual. So this is pictures, videos, or just observing something happen with their eyes. Verbal, now this doesn't have to just be the spoken word, this can also be written words, but a verbal learner learns best from text. So there's some people who can read a maneuver description in a maneuver description guide or the NATOPS 100 times, and if they're really a visual more than a verbal learner, that description just doesn't do that much for them. It isn't until they get in the aircraft and they see maybe an instructor demonstrate the maneuver for them, all of a sudden it clicks, it makes sense, they understand. Whereas another student, if you demonstrate it for them and all they've done is just seen you do it, doesn't click, right? If they're a verbal learner, they need to be able to read it, digest it, see those words, or hear you describe the procedures, and from there, they're able to piece together what they should be doing or what they want to do. And the last pair is global versus sequential. So a sequential learner is someone who's going to learn things best step by step. Step 1, step 2, step 3, and you'll see as they get each individual step, their progress is obvious. You can see how they're making progress, you can see them improving step by step. Whereas a global learner tends to learn in large jumps. They're taking things on each step of the way as you're showing them something, and then the next thing that follows, and working through those building blocks that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But they don't seem to make progress until all of a sudden they make a ton of progress, because they have to see the whole picture, have taken on board each of those individual steps, and then grasp the whole concept before they're really able to apply it. And so a global learner may seem like they're struggling, even if really they aren't. They just haven't gotten through the whole maneuver or the whole concept or the whole application that lets them get to that stage where they're able to apply it at a global level. The reason we care about learning styles, the reason you should care about learning styles, is if you are approaching a student with a teaching technique that doesn't match their learning style, you're going to waste your effort, your student isn't going to learn as well. You as an instructor want to try to draw out of your student what type of learning styles work best for them, and if they don't know necessarily, if you have an understanding of these spectrums of learning styles, you can approach instructional problems to try one, maybe try the other. If they're having a real hard time understanding a maneuver after they've read about it, go out and demo it for them. If you've demoed it for them and they still don't seem to be getting it, ask them, have they really read through the chapter? Have they digested the description? Have they had time to sit down and think about to chair fly through the sequence? And that can help you break through with a student who may be having trouble with a particular concept or maneuver and show them in a different way that better matches their learning style. After talking about learning styles, now we're going to hit on a couple of additional concepts when it comes to the learning process and things that affect your students' ability to learn, your ability to teach, one of which is multitasking. Lots of people like to say they're great multitaskers, they multitask really well, it's something they've always done throughout their life. But a lot of science to date has shown that multitasking to a certain extent is a myth. Your brain, your body cannot perform simultaneously a bunch of discrete tasks that are, really different from each other. And this is why, people get into car wrecks while they're talking on the cell phone while they're driving, right? They become distracted. They're not actually capable of multitasking. They're not paying attention to the road, and then they crash. When you are multitasking, or you think you're multitasking, or your student thinks they're multitasking, likely they're doing one of two types of behaviors that we associate with multitasking. One is attention switching, and the other is simultaneous performance. On the left here, we've got a picture of our student. They're running a checklist. They're in the aircraft. They're maybe getting set up for some type of maneuver, and they're working through the checklist. Now, in this case, probably what they're doing is moving quickly back and forth between looking down at the checklist and performing the checklist, and looking up either at a mission display or flight display, looking outside the aircraft. And so their attention is constantly going back and forth between those two things. And that is what's giving this feeling of multitasking. They're both working the checklist and paying attention to the screen, the outside, the aircraft, whatever it might be. But in reality, they're not actually performing both of those functions at the same time. They can't look outside the aircraft and read the checklist at the same time. Your body's not capable of it. They're attention switching back and forth. And attention switching really makes you vulnerable to two things that can interrupt it. So distractions and interruptions. Distractions are, you're switching your attention back and forth between that checklist and the outside of the aircraft, and all of a sudden something distracts you. A master caution comes on, and you look down, you realize, ECS has come off, the C power has been selected on by the other pilot. Now you've been distracted, and as you go back to that checklist or back to outside, maybe you skip a couple steps, maybe you miss something because you were trying to switch your attention back and forth, and then your attention was pulled away. Now you have not necessarily gone back to the same place you were before. And interruptions can be the same thing, whether that's a conversation over ICS, a radio call, something that breaks up that attention switching process, where you're no longer actively switching back and forth, and that multitasking breaks down, and usually one of those things that you're trying to multitask falls out, and an error is likely to come after that. Simultaneous performance is where you're able to do generally one physical task that has reached that state that we talked to earlier about, that automatic response, where you are able to perform a simple physical task without applying specific brain power to it. And in this case, we've got our 3-ship light division here. Probably a 4-ship is the aircraft that's taking this picture. And -2, -3, -4 here, the flying pilot is most likely on a nice VFR day depicted in this photo, able to hold their stationing, able to keep the aircraft in its proper formation position without really thinking consciously about that task if they're an experienced pilot. They just see their relative position, their closure, their stationing from the other aircraft, and without really thinking about it, they're putting in those inputs to hold that position. That allows them then to perform another function, to execute, to talk on the radio, to execute some type of other procedure, to coach maybe the other pilot that they're flying with, or to think about maybe what's coming up next in the mission or the flight. But this opens you up to two potential failures. You aren't you aren't really multitasking because you aren't actually putting really brain power into that physical task you're doing. And this is that, cell phone conversation while driving. That driving becomes the automatic response function where you're just putting inputs in as you drive down the highway, and your focus is on your phone call. And then as soon as you become fixated, that is when all of a sudden you lose those inputs that were feeding that kind of unconscious physical process. So fixation and attention, kind of two sides of the same coin, but in general, it's going to be something that draws your attention away from one of those two things that you are simultaneously performing. And if it's the stimuli that you're relying on to execute that automatic response type physical function, in this case maybe formation flying, if you get fixated inside the cockpit on an instrument or a mission display, an indication, and you're no longer looking at that other aircraft to provide you those cues, you aren't able to maintain proper stationing without necessarily thinking about it, and you may develop excessive closure or excessive drift, fall out of position, and create an error.